A warm welcome to our distinguished panelists and to all participants. I'm Danielle Yeow, Adjunct Senior Research Fellow and Lead on Climate Change Law and Policy at the Centre for International Law at the National University of Singapore. It is my distinct pleasure to open and moderate this evening's discussion on the climate-oceans nexus and the synergies and interaction between the climate change and law of the sea regime, led by our very eminent and distinguished panel of experts, His Excellency Ambassador Arif Hafez Erigorsino, Dr. Niloufar Oral, and Professor Karen Scott. The presentations by our three speakers today will be followed by a discussion and a Q&A session. Participants are invited to submit your questions in writing via the chat function. The impetus for our discussion today is the increasing prominence of oceans-related considerations in climate change dialogue. While ocean health, biodiversity, and climate change have traditionally been siloed under the UN processes, there has been increased recognition that they are inseparable issues. The ocean plays an essential role in climate regulation, covering 70% of the planet, absorbing carbon dioxide and heat, and the life within it produces half the oxygen that we breathe. The latest science, especially from the 2019 IPCC Special Report on the Ocean and the Cryosphere, and the recent 2021 Second World Ocean Assessment, indicates that the tipping points are being reached and the risk is increasing, namely from acidification, warming, and sea level rise. The IPCC Special Report on the Ocean and Cryosphere in a Changing Climate drew policymakers' attention to the observed changes and impacts, the projected changes and risks of such changes and impacts to, for example, the ocean ecosystem and to people. The special report also addressed the responses to oceans and cryosphere change, noting that enabling climate resilience and sustainable development depends critically on urgent and increasingly ambitious emissions reduction, coupled with coordinated, sustained, coordinated action as well as adaptation actions. The key enablers for the enabling effective responses to climate-related changes in the ocean include intensifying cooperation and coordination among governing authorities across spatial scales and planning horizons. As flagged in the IPCC report, everyone depends directly or indirectly on the ocean, which covers about 71% of the Earth's surface and contains 97% of the Earth's water. Around 10% of the Earth's land area is also covered by glaciers or ice sheets, and together they support unique habitats and are interconnected with other components of the climate system through global exchange of water, energy, and carbon. Human communities in close connection with coastal environments and small islands are particularly exposed to oceans and cryosphere change, such as sea level rise and extreme sea level, while other communities further afield are also exposed to the changes, such as through extreme weather events. Indeed, the state of the ocean and the cryosphere interacts with each aspect of sustainability reflected in the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Now, to dial back a little, in COP25 in Madrid, the efforts of the COP25 presidency in highlighting the importance of the ocean, including as an integral part of the Earth's climate system, and of ensuring the integrity of the ocean and coastal ecosystem in the context of climate change, was specifically flagged and commended in Decision 1 CP25, also known as the Chile Madrid Time for Action. A formal request was made to the chair of Substar to convene the dialogue on the ocean and climate change to consider how to strengthen mitigation and adaptation action in this context. Parties and non-party stakeholders were invited to submit inputs to inform this dialogue. Now, while the emergence of the global COVID pandemic has resulted in practical delays, numerous submissions from a diverse range of parties and non-party stakeholders were received, reflecting the importance of this issue. The Substar chair's informal summary of reports of the Ocean Dialogue, which were eventually convened in December 2020, highlighted the interest of governments in strengthening the understanding of and action on ocean and climate change adaptation and mitigation. It is clear from the discussion that silos, in terms of both process and practice, must be broken down. There is now rich scientific knowledge base on ocean and climate change, and indeed a recognition of an urgent need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to limit the scale of climate change impacts on the ocean, as well as to increase resilience to the impacts and risks to ecosystems. The oceans must be considered as a part of the solutions for both mitigation and adaptation. Thirdly, the ocean is considered in some of the activities and agenda actions under the UNFCCC now, as well as in mandates across the wider UN system. Many countries are considering increasing ambition in the NDCs and the national adaptation plans. In his report, the SABSA chair encouraged parties to strengthen their ambition and financing as well for integrated ocean and climate action. Where are we now? The report, finally, before I move on, the report also contained options and opportunities for strengthening action under the UNFCCC, across the UN processes at large, at the national level, as well as to strengthen finance and cross-cutting support. So where are we now? The recent Decision 1 or CP26 at the conclusion of the meetings in Glasgow has continued this ocean focus and invited the relevant work programs and constituted bodies under the UNFCCC to consider how to integrate and strengthen ocean-based action in their existing mandates and work plans. An annual dialogue to strengthen ocean-based action was also established. Apart from the Decision 1 CP26, COP26 also witnessed numerous other oceans-related developments and announcements, such as the signing by 20 countries of the third installment of the Because of the Ocean Declaration, as well as the announcement of various financing measures for example, the Global Funds for Coral Reefs. There were also announcements for plans for a new mega MPA, Marine Protected Area, in the Eastern Tropical Pacific, involving Colombia, Costa Rica, Ecuador, and Panama. What then is the significance of all these developments? How will the ocean's considerations be addressed in the UNFCCC context going forward? What actions can be taken in the maritime context to address climate change? What are the synergies between and implications of the heightened action to the integration and strengthening of ocean-based climate action on the law of the sea and the international marine protection regime? I hope that we can reflect on these issues in our discussions today. With that, it is my distinct pleasure to invite, firstly, His Excellency Ambassador Arif Havas Arigosino, Indonesia's ambassador to the Federal Republic of Germany, as our first speaker for this evening. He was previously Indonesia's ambassador to Belgium, Luxembourg, the European Union, as well as the Deputy Minister to the Coordinating Ministry of Maritime Affairs, as well as Director General for Law and the International Treaties of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He is an eminent expert in this field and needs not much further introduction. I can only commend participants to read his impressive and full bio, which is available on the CIL events link. May I now invite Ambassador, please, to address us.
Thank you very much, Danielle, for the kind words and introductions. Once again, I would like to express my thanks to you and for also Nilu and CIL team to invite me for this discussion today, and also greetings to Professor Scott, Karen, how are you in New Zealand? Great to see you again in these discussions. I have 2 slides, but before I share the slide, I just want to share with you what I have in mind, my thinking about this very I'm not so sure it's difficult, but very interesting issue between UNFCCC and UNCLOS. One of the things that we have been hearing since 2015 was the fact that we want to mainstream the ocean discussions in the UNFCCC. I'm one of those persons, and I believe Nilu as well, who we were not very successful in 2015 in bringing ocean in Paris Agreement, but we were trying to have this mainstreaming thinking. But after Glasgow, after chatting with a number of people, I started to have some doubt, to be frank, on this mainstreaming, because it might not be the right approach, because we are looking at 2 different instruments. UNCLOS is, as we all know, a very strong legally binding documents with enforcements. And it has courts to enforce rules in UNCLOS. Okay, the legal obligations are clear. The word shells are everywhere in the conventions. And for us, Indonesia, if we want to establish a baseline, for instance, there is even a mathematical requirement that we have to fulfill. There is a comparative mathematical ratio of land and water, for instance. It's a very, very rigid document in some parts. Others are slightly floated, but I think in general, it's a very legally binding document with enforcement at different chapters. Whereas Paris Agreement, the legally binding aspect is the processes, but not the content itself. I recall in 15, Nilu, the Americans simply refused to have a legally binding instrument because they have to convince Congress, which for sure they will not get it. So that's why the one that is legally binding is the process, but the obligations are, the compliance are optionals. That's why we come up with this clever thinking of the NDC, the nationally determined commitments. You know, it's this kind of approach. You know, is conferences, discussions, consensus. And of course, there is no courts, there is no third party, there is no litigations, there is no legal course under the Paris Agreement. So I think this is where I have some problems now in using the word mainstreaming, because how can we mainstream ocean's constitution issue to a not really legally binding documents? Okay. I think you will hear more detail from Nilu's presentation, also for Professor Scott's excellent presentations. Now, I only want to go back on the existing one, because people talk about, you know, after COP26, what will the Egyptian do? You know, after that, what will we do? But what about the existing one that we already have and it's already legally binding? And that is Chapter 12 of UNCLOS, right? Chapter 12, as we all know, is very comprehensive. Okay, it has identified clearly the source of pollutions. You have land-based source, you have sea-based source, you have dumping source, you have source coming from vessels. And interestingly enough, you have pollutions from or through the atmosphere. And if we go on the definitions of what pollution is, under the conventional law of the sea, pollution means pollutions of the marine environment by introduction of man directly or indirectly. You see all these definitions, you know, in the convention. I don't have to mention everything, but CO2 emissions is, of course, absolutely a pollution that is, as mentioned by Danielle in the presentation, that ocean has the burden of absorbing them. You will have a detailed analysis from Professor Scott, the type of damages that ocean is having now. In Indonesia, we have seen some really bad coral reef situations, rising of sea levels. We experience that in daily life. Some corals are good, some corals are great, but we have 30% are not in the good conditions. And this is already been actually covered by the convention. And not only that, the Convention on the Law of the Sea provides very detailed the type of pollutions that is being covered, but even also provides enforcement. We can enforce these particular situations allowed within the context of the UNCLOS itself. The only thing that we cannot enforce is enforcement against foreign vessels, government vessels, military vessels. But there's a very clear rules that we can actually enforce this rule. And if you go on different cases of pollution, for instance, you have the Soa Maru cases in Straits of Malacca in 75, the Deepwater Horizon in the US, Gulf of Mexico. We can actually see that there is a way to litigate damages done by third party creating pollutions in your water. So, but we don't have that yet in terms of the CO2 emission that affect rising of sea level or destructions of coral reef, for instance. So I think this is the angle where member states of UNCLOS, Law of the Sea, can actually look at how they can protect the environment, to preserve the marine environment that has been, unduly tasked to absorb all the CO2 coming from industry, coming from land-based pollutions. Chapter 12 also mentioned about obligation of states to individually or jointly protect and preserve the marine environment. So the legal basis is there. And this is a strong legal basis, in my view, that can be enforced. We have a very clear mandate, Article 212, Chapter 2123 here. There is a clear legal obligations towards states acting especially through competent international organization or diplomatic conferences shall endeavor to establish global and regional rules, standards, and recommended practices and procedures to prevent and reduce and control such pollution. So Article 212 is a legal basis that is very strong, and that's why the terminology of mainstreaming may not be actually correct, because how do we have to mainstream these legally binding obligations into document or conferences that is not based on legally binding obligation, but only optional? So that is the legal issue that we face now. We all know that there are updated versions of NDC, and if we look at different analysis on the updated versions of NDCs, 54 countries include at least one ocean elements in their updated NDCs. This is very bad because we have 168 member states of UNCLOS, and only 54, include ocean. Even so, it means that even us, the state parties of UNCLOS, we are not being responsible of implementing Article 212, implementing Chapter 12. So we have done our part. Indonesia here, you see some of the elements that they have done here. But the majority of member states of Law of the Sea did not even bother, right? So I don't know why, whether it is a lack of political will or just simply lack of awareness. But I believe that we need to do more, even within the member states of UNCLOS, to look at our response on the legal obligations to protect marine environment individually or jointly through international organizations or diplomatic conferences. Now we know the state parties conferences, it's administrative. I led them once all the way back 2010. We are not going to go into substance. We know that, but we have BBNJ, a discussion on instrument that comes from the element of UNCLOS. So it's possible that we have a new arrangements or a new discussions or a new instrument, if you will, under the UNCLOS itself on particular aspect of the conventions that is that is being obligated. And that's not the only one. We have the CLCS rules, we have the area rules and constitution of the area itself. We have the fisheries convention. So it's not a finished discussion, but it's a dynamic discussion that you are still allowed to do something on the implementation of the conventions in a different manners. Last slide, conclusions. Okay, so from the convention itself, we can see from UNCLOS that UNCLOS is a very comprehensive and a strong document. It's strong. It means it has a clear enforcement for the legal obligation for states to protect marine environment, including the enforcement issue. And from Paris to Glasgow, there is still discrepancy. We all know that it does not take the word ocean on the treaty itself, and we all know that to be frank, states are abstract, delegations are concrete, and delegations who come to UNFCCC are not the same guys who goes to state parties all over the sea. That's a fact of life. These people, they live in different offices from different ministries, different interests domestically, and they may not talk to each other. I have no idea of the setup in different countries, but this is what we face today. So it's either lack of awareness or political will. That is why the thinking is mainstreaming. So if you are actually having two different sets of people within one state dealing with this particular issue, of course, people in the realm of the environment and forestry, they are thinking of mainstreaming. But for us in the law of the sea communities, it's very clear. There is a legal obligation within the convention itself that directly involved in the UNFCCC discussions. It does not need to be mainstream because it's a legally binding obligation. So what to do? So some thinking here. State parties, we should look at the ways and means to utilize and implement Article 212. Okay. We can do that within the state parties itself or through the UNFCCC. So we understand that not all UNFCCC state parties are state party of the UNCLOS. The US, for instance, is not. And that is one particular aspect that we have to look at. But bringing this to UNFCCC, looking at the latest discussion of the word phase out and phase down, I think realistically speaking, it's going to be tough. We hope to bring in the discussion within UNFCCC itself without us, the state parties, doing something about it clearly. Another idea, I know it's difficult, it's to get a clarity on the relationship, legal relationship between UNCLOS, especially Chapter 12 and UNFCCC processes by asking advisory opinion to ITLOS. I think this will help clarify things. This will be able to provide member states of both treaties on actually what needs to be done in terms of fulfilling on one side legally binding obligations, and on the other side a compliance mechanism that is not optional, but it somehow represents or reflects the legal obligations of UNCLOS in the protections of the marine environment. So that's it. More questions? No solutions. I hope this will be able to instill our thinking on how we can do much better in the future. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. That was a really fascinating, I think, presentation on the issues that have been raised, a lot of food for thought. And the question of what does the term mainstreaming even means, and it can be viewed from different perspectives. On the one hand, there is this question of the policy mainstreaming, perhaps, in terms of how there is internal coordination among the relevant the sea, oceans, and climate change environment agencies, and that goes to the point that you've raised about how this is reflected in the blue NDCs, if I could use that term. And then the second aspect is what you have, Ambassador, you've referred to, perhaps in terms of a normative mainstreaming or normative alignment between two different international legal regimes, and looking very much forward to the discussion and the viewpoints of other speakers and the participants. With that, if you allow me, I will move to the second speaker for the evening first, and then we can bring everything together in our discussion. And that would be Professor Karen Scott from the University of Canterbury. Karen researches in the areas of the law of the sea, international environmental law, and polar law, much of which focus, in fact, on climate change and its intersection with and the impact of these areas of law. Karen also researches in the area of international environmental governance. She's the editor-in-chief of the Ocean Development and International Law, and is also on the editorial board of the Australian Yearbook of International Law. She currently serves as the president of the Australian and New Zealand Society of International Law. A list of her recent publications is accessible on the full bio on the CIL event page. Karen, it's my pleasure to invite you to address us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Danielle, and thank you to you and Nilofer and to the organisers of this seminar. It's a great pleasure and an honour to be here. My paper is actually going to focus on the issue of ocean acidification, and probably more by luck than judgment, I think follows on quite nicely from the remarks of His Excellency, the Indonesian Ambassador to Germany, because I'm also going to focus on UNCLOS and Article 212 and take perhaps a slightly different approach, but looking at how the nexus can be explored between the UNFCCC regime and UNCLOS. I do have some slides which I will endeavour to share with you now. Okay, so I think that works. So yes, as I say, my paper is focusing on sort of the third of the climate issues in connection with the oceans, often described as sort of the Cinderella of the climate change issues, because until relatively recently it has been somewhat overlooked in comparison with sort of ocean warming and sea level rise and those more prominent issues. So what is ocean acidification? Well, really what we're talking about here are changes to the ocean chemistry. Ocean pH, or essentially the chemistry of the ocean, has been remarkably stable for around 800,000 years at around 8.2. But over the last 200 years, which of course coincides with the onset of the Industrial Revolution, has decreased by 0.1 pH units. Now that doesn't sound like very much, but is actually the equivalent of an increase in ocean acidity of around 30%. And the cause of ocean acidity is primarily carbon dioxide. So it's the drawdown of carbon dioxide into the oceans, which is changing that ocean chemistry. And as Danielle explained eloquently in her introduction, the oceans, of course, are the largest sink for carbon dioxide. They draw down approximately 30% of anthropogenic emissions. So they play a really important role in mitigating atmospheric climate change. So why does it matter? Why does the increasing acidity of the oceans matter? Well, just move the screen on here. Oops, I've gone too far. It matters because essentially a decrease in ocean pH causes a decrease in the saturation of calcium carbonate in seawater. And calcium carbonate is really important in the context of being the principal compound in the shells and skeletons of many marine creatures, particularly coral reefs. So ocean acidification combined with ocean warming is a particular threat to the ocean's coral reefs and their ecosystem ecosystems. More recent research has suggested that it may also impact on the development of fish larvae, and that research has focused on tuna, of course, a really important commercially fished species, and has also suggested that actually changes in ocean chemistry can potentially affect the behaviour of fish, so actually persuading them to become less predator adverse, so essentially changing the nature of ecosystems. But I think it's fair to say we know sort of less about the potential long-term implications of ocean acidification, in contrast to some of the implications of warmer oceans or things like sea level rise. Now, given that ocean acidification is primarily caused by CO2 emissions, it squarely falls within the jurisdiction of the climate regime, so the UNFCCC, Kyoto Protocol and Paris Agreement. But notwithstanding the fact that there has been some recent movement to acknowledge the importance of the oceans, as described by Danielle in her introduction and as picked up by His Excellency in his paper, the oceans have been largely treated as very much a poor cousin of territory and atmosphere within the climate regime. There's been few in the way of sort of policy responses directly in relation to oceans. They're simply not front and centre of that regime. As a pollutant, and marine pollutant, they also fall squarely within the law of the sea, essentially within the UNCLOS regime, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. But again, ocean acidification and climate more generally has often struggled to come to the top of the agenda of the relevant law of the sea institutions. And whilst this is changing, the way the law of the sea works is that issues are largely dealt with on a sectoral basis, so fishing, shipping, and so forth. And that makes it quite hard to deal with something like climate change and ocean acidification on a holistic basis. So ocean acidification is subject to a classic regime complex. So it's the subject of separate but overlapping regimes, sometimes mutually reinforcing, but at times also potentially conflicting. What we see more recently in the context of ocean acidification is the development of soft law or more informal instruments to attempt to raise the profile of ocean acidification. So Sustainable Development Goal 14.3, which directly relates to ocean acidification, is probably the most high profile example of this. And this is quite important because these instruments play something of an interstitial role, building bridges between institutions within the regime complex and potentially developing a mandate for regulation. As we've already heard, there has been a really positive shift in terms of integrating the oceans into the climate regime, at least at the rhetorical level, if not at the practical level at this stage. So I think notably the United Nations General Assembly in its Law of the Sea, Oceans and Law of the Sea resolution in 2020 talked about the mainstreaming of oceans issues within the climate change regime, following on from COP25. And of course, I think significantly, most recently in COP26, the Glasgow Climate Pact also referred to integration of oceans and climate matters, and beginning that climate dialogue and looking at ways to strengthen ocean-based action within the existing mandate. So those are all very positive developments. Nevertheless, I would suggest that so far, and indeed today, the UNFCCC has really largely failed to engage with and address ocean acidification. And I think there are kind of three quite clear examples of why this is the case, or demonstrating that kind of failure to engage. So the first, His Excellency talked about the Paris Agreement as being kind of largely process driven in terms of its obligations, which is absolutely correct. And the primary target driving those process obligations is a temperature target, and the legally binding obligation is in relation to the target of 2 degrees. Now that of course has been developed with very little thought for the oceans, and the scientific consensus is largely that a 2-degree increase in fact would be inappropriate in the context of ocean warming. Of course, we have an aspirational target within that obligation of a 1.5-degree limit, and that was in fact very much pushed for by Pacific Island states and very much talked about in the context of the impact of warming on the oceans. And I think a positive outcome of the COP26 process has been that there was a lot of discussion of the 1.5 target as opposed to the 2-degree target. So there seems to be increasing acceptance, at least among a good number of states, that we should be aiming for 1.5 as opposed to 2 degrees. Second, there's no ocean pH target. So whilst we have a temperature target, we have no target which relates to ocean pH itself. And until this year, there has been no target, and there is still no legally binding target with respect to carbon dioxide emissions itself. So states have traditionally been allowed significant discretion in how they meet their obligations under both Kyoto and now Paris, but there's no specific target in relation to CO2. And when we're talking about ocean acidification, it really is CO2 that is the emissions that matter. I say until 2021 because one of the really positive aspects of the Glasgow Climate Pact is that we actually do have now a target in relation to CO2 emissions, obviously not contained within the protocol, so not formally binding as such, but nevertheless a normative target. So to reduce carbon dioxide emissions specifically by 45% by 2030 relative to 2010, and then net zero by mid-century. We've also got the first reference to coal power and fossil fuels, which of course primary emitters of CO2, although notoriously at the very end of the negotiations, as I'm sure our audience will be aware, the phrase phase out was rather controversially changed to phase down at the request of India. So picking up really on the theme of this webinar, and I think building hopefully some synergies with His Excellency's presentation, the question that I'm interested in is really whether the law of the sea, in fact, provides an obligation on states. So whether UNCLOS itself can identify an obligation under UNCLOS as distinct from the UNFCCC to address ocean acidification. And I would actually argue that there is such an obligation. There's an obligation on all parties to UNCLOS to address ocean acidification as a source of marine pollution. And I would actually go further or take a slightly different approach to His Excellency. I would actually suggest that merely complying with obligations under the Paris Agreement will not necessarily meet this obligation under UNCLOS. So what I want to do in the final part of this presentation is to explain my thinking as to why I'm making that argument. So His Excellency has already mentioned part 12 of UNCLOS, which of course establishes that general obligation to protect and preserve the marine environment. And Article 194, paragraph 1 provides a general obligation to prevent pollution from any source. Pollution is defined under UNCLOS as substances or energy introduced directly or indirectly into the marine environment that results in or is likely to result in deleterious effects as to harm to living resources or marine life. Now, whether introduced directly as a consequence of CO2 sequestration or indirectly through natural drawdown from the atmosphere or for ocean fertilization activities, I would argue that the impact of CO2 on marine life can be described as deleterious. And I would argue that you can describe CO2 as pollution for the purposes of UNCLOS. And in doing so, that then falls within the obligation under Article 194, paragraph 1. So as I think our audience members all know, the broad obligation to prevent pollution is developed within UNCLOS on a sectoral basis in relation to specific sources of pollution. And with respect to ocean acidification, there are 2 articles which are of particular relevance, 212 relating to the atmosphere and 207 relating to land-based sources of pollution. And just for the purposes of time, I'm going to focus on Article 212 today. So I think it's just worth noting that the inclusion of atmospheric pollution within UNCLOS was actually advocated in the very early stages of the UNCLOS negotiations way back in 1973. So UNCLOS was actually one of the first global treaties that recognised atmospheric pollution as a source of marine pollution. Under Article 12, state parties to UNCLOS must adopt laws and regulations to prevent atmospheric pollution of the marine environment in respect of territory or vessels under their jurisdiction, taking into account internationally agreed rules. Now, this is a due diligence obligation, so it relates to effort as opposed to outcome. And of course, the concept of due diligence in the context of the law of the sea has been developed in a number of relevant judicial decisions. I would argue that this obligation, this due diligence obligation, applies to ocean acidification. So the question is, what is the content of this obligation? What are states obliged to do? Well, Article 212, like other articles under UNCLOS, refers to internationally agreed rules and standards. But unlike other provisions under UNCLOS, it's not clear what those international rules and standards are. So, for example, we have the same language used or similar language used in relation to vessel source pollution and in relation to dumping, and it's quite clear what those standards are. That's not the case for Article 212, except in relation to air pollution from vessels, essentially vessel source emissions, where we do have a clear instrument here, essentially MARPOL Annex 6. Now, a teleological interpretation of UNCLOS would perhaps suggest that the UNFCCC regime provides those rules and standards. After all, the UNFCCC and now the Paris Agreement is the primary global regime for addressing climate change. And importantly, in the context of ocean acidification, it's the primary regime for addressing CO2 emissions. However, although the overall aim of the UNFCCC is clearly supportive of the object of Articles 212 of UNCLOS, the focus of the regime is very much on the atmosphere rather than the hydrosphere, and notwithstanding the various positive developments that we've talked about in the early part of this seminar today, I would suggest that this still remains largely the case. So in terms of the Paris Agreement, I've mentioned already the temperature target, which was not really developed with the oceans in mind, the fact that there's no pH target, and the fact that states have significant discretion under the Paris Agreement in terms of how they meet those targets. And that discretion means that they will not necessarily address ocean acidification. So I suppose the fundamental question for me is, even if states comply with their obligations under the UNFCCC, and specifically the Paris Agreement, and of course that's quite a significant if there, but assuming that they do, have they met their due diligence obligation under UNCLOS? Well, on the one hand, you could argue that the UNFCCC provides the lex specialis in respect of atmospheric pollution, and it would be unreasonable to expect states to go beyond the climate commitments, particularly when UNCLOS doesn't in fact provide any additional information or guidance as to what states would do. So I think that's the argument, that essentially it is the UNFCCC regime, and that provides the standards. On the other hand, I think you can argue, well, if you can demonstrate that the UNFCCC Paris commitments are clearly insufficient to prevent, control, reduce and control pollution constituting or leading to ocean acidification, it would seem to be anachronistic to argue that compliance with those standards constitutes due diligence in this context. So if essentially we're saying those standards are simply not appropriate in the context of ocean acidification, I don't see how you can say that by meeting those standards, you have met the due diligence obligation under UNCLOS. So I would actually argue that the due diligence obligation under UNCLOS to prevent, control and reduce pollution of the marine environment caused by ocean acidification is not met by meeting the UNFCCC Paris commitments, except where those commitments expressly relate to ocean acidification, essentially to CO2 reductions. And I think that conclusion is actually supported by the various instruments and soft law instruments which have been adopted relatively recently relating to ocean acidification, such as SDG 14.3, where they're calling upon states to address ocean acidification distinct from and beyond their obligations under the UNFCCC regime, which I think implicitly recognises that the UNFCCC Paris obligations don't adequately address ocean acidification. So why is this important? Well, I mean, COP26 clearly confirms that the climate regime is the primary forum for addressing mitigation of adaptation to and the consequences of climate change. There's no doubt about that. But it's not the only game in town. It's not the only legally relevant regime. And that's in fact acknowledged within the Glasgow Climate Pact itself. UNCLOS, as a globally legally binding regime, and as pointed out by His Excellency, as a regime which actually has a significantly more robust set of instruments supporting its implementation and enforcement, requires states to protect the oceans. It requires states to prevent, mitigate, and control ocean acidification. So I would suggest that when you're interpreting obligations as a state under the UNFCCC, and indeed under UNCLOS, you need to implement a systemic integrated interpretation, which requires the consideration of state obligations under UNCLOS in that interpretation. So states need to consider ocean acidification as well as climate change, and they need to consider their obligations under UNCLOS when they're acting domestically and internationally in the context of their climate commitments. So COP27, which is to be held in Egypt next year, I think provides the next opportunity to more robustly address ocean acidification and certainly to move on the ocean's climate dialogue. But I would urge states that are party to UNCLOS, which as the majority of states, with the notable exception of the United States, to consider their obligations under UNCLOS when thinking about ocean acidification. And I look forward to your comments and your discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Karen. Again, it's a wonderful segue from His Excellency Ambassador's remarks on the ocean climate nexus and the different international regimes that govern, and again referring to the different nature, one being legally binding with enforceable strong mechanisms, another which is more aspirational in terms of the outcome, but more legal and stronger and binding in terms of the process. Your comments suggested, should I say, a gap perhaps in the references to acidification in the UNFCCC climate governance and Paris Agreement climate governance structures. One question I had, and I hope we can come back to this later, it's really in relation to climate change and acidification. The question here really is acidification, or a contributor to climate change, or is it actually a result of that, in specifically the CO2 emissions? And that perhaps the answer to that question could perhaps point us to the location in which the placement of the obligations, whether substantive or procedural, that can be best placed to address these questions. But nonetheless, a very, very interesting references and discussion about the really fragmented nature or the multiple regimes, perhaps would be a more accurate way of putting it, in terms of the multiple concurrent regimes that touch and intersect with each other, and the difficulty and perhaps the challenge for us is in entangling and aligning these different regimes. Now, with that, I turn to our final, but certainly not the least speaker for this evening, friend and colleague, Dr. Newfoundland, the Center Director for the Center for International Law. Nilofer is a member of the ILC, where she co-chairs the study group on sea level rise in relation to international law. And she has been a member of the law faculty at Istanbul Bilgi University since 1998. She has advised Turkey on matters relating to the law of the sea and climate change, and has also herself served as a climate change negotiator for a number of years. Nilofer has also appeared before the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea. May I invite Nilofer now to address us. Participants will also invite you to refer to her full bio on the CIL event link, which also references the extensive publications in which she has published as well on this topic. Nilofer, over to you, please.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Danielle. And may I say that what a pleasure and honor it is for me to follow my distinguished co-panelists, Ambassador Havas, who I've known for many years, and he always places a new light, a different light, an enlightening light, may I say, on the issue. So I really appreciated your comments, and also Karen Scott, a valued colleague, and I think that you really raised some very good points. So what I'm going to do is take it from a different perspective, and I think it kind of follows up on the point made by Ambassador Havas on this whole issue of mainstreaming. And I think you may be right. I think I may be agreeing with you on this. So let me just get my, let's see, hold on, share, oops. So what I'm really going to look at is the place of the ocean in the climate change regime, but starting from 1990. And I think I really would like to show how remiss we've been in excluding or limiting. I shouldn't say exclude, because the ocean is in the climate change regime, but it's limited and it's a very functional purpose, it's a sinker reservoir. Whereas now, and I think Professor Scott outlined it, it is now actually suffering from the adverse impacts of climate change. So why is it that it is what I would say kind of the, maybe I should say, I have here the missing link or the weak link. Maybe I'll change that. Why is the ocean the weak link in the system of climate change when it is so critical to the whole climate system? The whole climate system depends on the ocean. And so is it that we didn't know about the problem? Is it that we lack the scientific information? No, not at all. In fact, 1989, there was the first conference of small states, and it was headed by the Maldives, and they actually made a declaration, 1989, warning about the impacts of sea level rise due to climate change. And they warned about the increase in global temperatures, 1989, and this was before we have the 1992 UNFCCC. So they were calling for the negotiation of a framework convention. This was followed up 1990, hold on, and maybe I should do this a little differently. One moment, let's see. Okay, let me do this. So this was followed up in 1990, the first IPCC report, and this is just a summary for policymakers. And 1990, the IPCC is warning already about sea level rise and ocean warming. I'm not going to go through all this because of the time, but I'm going to go through each report that is warned about the impacts of climate change, greenhouse gas emissions on the ocean, that the net uptake of carbon dioxide may decrease, meaning that the ocean will no longer be able to absorb this because it absorbs quite a bit, and global sea level rise. So in 1992, the UNFCCC was adopted. Did it include anything about the ocean or sea level rise? very limited, as I said earlier. In Article 4.1d, it simply made references to the oceans, coastal marine ecosystems within the function of a sink and reservoir. That means absorbing and storing, in this case for the ocean, it's carbon dioxide only. And that, even the language, and I think Ambassador Havas is so right, the language is sought to promote sustainable management and promote and cooperate in the conservation and enhancement, whereas in the Law of the Sea Convention, it's very clear. It's a very clear obligation. So, you know, the ocean was given very limited place. Again, 1995, the IPCC's second assessment, sea level rise, the impact on biodiversity in general, but including, of course, the oceans, also the coastal systems, impacts of coral reefs. All of these were highlighted. Also that how many of the coastal populations will be vulnerable to flooding and erosion. And of course, what's really disturbing is that sea level is actually projected to continue to rise in future centuries beyond 2100. So even after stabilization is reached, even if we were right now to go to zero emissions, sea level rise is locked in. It's just a question of how much. 1990. 2001, again, we have the scientists informing us, particularly in relation to sea level rise, but also I would say that the impacts of ocean warming. Now, it wasn't until 2007 that ocean acidification is placed on the map. It was recently termed. So again, I think you've got a good explanation from Professor Scott. I won't go into it. So as of 2007, we are aware of ocean acidification and the very serious impacts that it's having on the ocean. 2014, again, more scientific information exactly on what the impacts of excessive carbon dioxide absorption by the ocean leading to this decrease in pH balance and the increasing warming of the oceans. So I'm just going through this, all this information, and then we get to the 2015 Paris Agreement. Where's the ocean? So, and I was there, and Ambassador Havas, you know, there was an effort. It wasn't as if there was silence. There was an effort to have what we're calling now mainstreaming, bringing the ocean under the UNFCCC, but there was resistance, and we won't go into that. But the preamble makes reference to the oceans. But again, all we do is have a reiteration of Article 4.1d of the Convention, and again, promoting the sustainable management conservation of oceans as a sink and reservoir. So all this information is there, but yet the system is still resisting, still not what I would say reflecting the reality of the impact of climate change on the ocean. And I think that Danielle, you mentioned this, very important. Finally, there's all this pressure, particularly from the scientists and certain ocean states, I would say, calling for a special study on the oceans. And finally, in 2019, the IPCC issued a special report on oceans in the cryosphere. And again, we know rising sea levels, melting ice, ocean warming, increased acidification, deoxygenation. In essence, the health of the ocean is absolutely deteriorating because of climate change. So, and now the most recent 6th report. So, efforts to streamline the ocean into the UNFCCC. Well, as I said, it is not in the Paris Agreement, not in the in the 1992. You've had now some background as to the efforts that have been made pre-COP26, and then during COP26. It's great. The SBSTA has started this ocean dialogue in 2020, but I have to underline that these are informal dialogues. They are not formal dialogues, but important. I would not certainly minimize the importance. And there was a great deal of interest. And you can get a synthesis report on that. But what I want to focus on today specifically, because we've already had some background on the NDCs. Again, we should have more states placing the ocean in the NDCs, but there's no requirements, completely voluntary. Yes, some progress was made in COP26, and I think that in the decision, the Glasgow Pact, Karen gave a nice summary of that. Now what? So the next key date is 2023. Article 14 provides for a global stocktake. This is absolutely critical. This is where now the last 5 years or so of actions taken, the NDCs, put together, but not just the NDCs. I mean, has a very broad scope to include environment, social issues, economic issues, but there's going to be an assessment made, really to see where are we, how are we, what progress are we making towards achieving the long-term goals. And of course, in this case, we're looking at the temperature target. And it's not limited to mitigation action, but also to adaptation, implementation, and it is to be carried out in the light of equity and best available science. And again, as I said, looking at the social and economic consequences. The function of the global stocktake is to inform future actions in updating and enhancing in a nationally determined manner, and also to enhance international cooperation for climate action. So I'm not, in the interest of time, I'm not going to go through all of that, but where's the ocean in this? I mean, really, again, the science, we're talking about best scientific information. The science is quite clear on the status of the ocean. But the problem is this global stocktake is quite complicated, the way they've got it set it up. So it's under the SBSTA chairs. They have the responsibility for starting now. They're going to have, at this point, it's the information collection and preparation phase, so gathering information, and the Secretariat will prepare a synthesis report. The question is, will the ocean be part of this? Now, that's what I underlined earlier. The dialogues are informal dialogues, because there's also going to be a technical assessment phase, and this is when they will be looking at the assessing all the information. And the consideration of the outputs in a high-level event, that's component 3. What's important too is that the chairs of the SBI and the SBSTA are supposed to establish joint contact groups and have technical dialogues and prepare guiding questions for each. So if we're talking about mainstreaming, certainly this would have to be the starting point, but we don't have any direction of that. It's implicit, perhaps you could read it into the decision of the Glasgow, that ocean is supposed to be incorporated into all the bodies, and certainly this would be part of it. But I think here states really have to push for this. Otherwise, in 2023, when that assessment is made, the ocean will be outside of that assessment. So, and this is, this is from the website itself, showing the whole trajectory of issues, of steps that will be taken. Again, 2023 is the global stocktake. 2025, you have to communicate new NDCs. But again, all of this, are we not going to put the ocean somewhere in there other than informally or best efforts, soft? I understand nationally determined, but I'm not sure that this is enough. So I think that I'm just going to say, I really think that's why I appreciate the comments made by Ambassador Havas. You know, how much effort can we really expect from the climate change regime that they will take action on the ocean, Or maybe it does make more sense to simply turn to the Law of the Sea Convention and really the clear obligations there, looking for ways to address these issues. The problem is it doesn't have the mechanisms that the climate change regime has. It doesn't have the SPLOS doesn't work as a conference of the parties. But there are other ways, you know, and maybe we can discuss that. So I'll stop here, my presentation, but, you know, basically the ocean, we've known about impact of climate change on the ocean since the very beginning of the climate change regime. Here we are, how many years later, and unfortunately we've just made a slight dent, and I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Nilofer, for bringing the discussion to a wonderful close, because we have brought the discussion back to the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement context and the processes. When you talk about global stocktake, is that one of the mechanisms that we can look forward to in 2023 as a way to where this oceans issue has greater prominence? As you have quite rightly pointed out, the Oceans Dialogue Climate is an informal process. For specific reasons, the negotiators and the parties in COP25 in Madrid did not include this as a formal agenda item, under the formal agenda item. It was specifically deliberately crafted as an informal dialogue outside of the formal process. As we can see how it landed up, that was the outcome. And there are probably reasons for that, though that the parties may be able to share if there are any representatives on our discussions today. But the question is, how do we ensure that oceans, which has so far, as you said, been there in the background, but has slowly and evolved in a very slow and evolutionary way, almost made its way into the center of the discussions. Campaigners such as John Kerry, the US Special Envoy, himself sees this annual dialogue, this annual oceans dialogue, as a key to ensuring that the ocean would play a role in UN in the mitigation, adaptation, and finance goals. And how can it be done? And the quote from him was that when the world talks about the climate crisis, the ocean crisis must be front and center in that conversation. And one way to ensure that it happens is to establish an ongoing forum for ocean issues here in Glasgow in the COP26 decision text. And that was indeed the outcome that was eventually achieved. So there we are. What can we see? What can we expect? Yes, Nilofer, did you want to add something to that?
Yeah, I just do. I mean, and I have to say, I mean, and I think Ambassador Havas, I mean, back in Paris Agreement, you know, if there's the ocean, the reflection of the ocean in the preamble, if I can say, I actually was a person who proposed that. It was the preamble and also an operative paragraph. But there was a great deal of resistance, particularly from the secretary and the presidency at that time. And I'm only explaining this that because they're just worried about bringing in new elements. So this whole dialogue business, to me, is almost is really sidelining. It sounds great, you've got John Kerry, but what does that mean, dialogue? You know, so I just want to add that this has been going on for a very long time. States, and I'm sure Indonesia is part of the declaration they signed in Paris, and they keep signing, but there's always been this resistance, so a dialogue. Anyway, I just want to say that because I'm really skeptical.
Thanks, Nilofer, for adding that background. I mean, I was involved in the discussions in Madrid as well. And certainly that the reluctance that you mentioned to include further agenda items into the formal agenda certainly was continued to get a lot of airwaves, so to airplay, if I could put it that way. So with that very fascinating 3 presentations, all very different, but all in fact align very well in terms of the coherence of the issues we have to discuss. It's a wonderful foundation for the discussion that we have. And in the interest of time, I will go, if I may, firstly to the questions that have been posed. And the first was, which was actually posed by Professor Backman and it's a question to Karen, but I think this is applicable to all the panelists as well. It's a very interesting question, whether or not you would recommend that the states request an advisory opinion on the obligations on the UNCLOS, and what would be its pros and cons. And before the panelists, before I give the floor to the panelists, may I take this opportunity also to flag, in coming back to His Excellency Ambassador Hava's comments on how on possibly utilizing the enforceable or legally binding mechanisms available within UNCLOS to bring in some of these issues as well, and use that as a basis. The question I had, and this was also touched upon in Karen's presentation, is that here we have a regime that was deliberately crafted with softer language in terms of the substantive elements. And that was a key ingredient and a key impetus for an agreement in the first place, without which we possibly would not have the Paris Agreement today. And if we layer that together with now legally using mechanisms from other regimes to try and, I would say, perhaps strengthen the goals and which were intentionally drafted in a more softer language, would this have greater systemic implications in state parties' willingness to actually garner attention on other issues, which would otherwise not have been possible unless that was actually crafted in that way? So that would be a question, the context as well, in which I would be very, very keen to hear the views of our panelists on. Thank you. Perhaps if I would start with Karen, as the question was posed in that context to you, but I would be very much inviting the other two speakers, Ambassador and Nilofer, to address this as well. Karen, over to you, please.
Well, thank you very much, Danielle, and thank you very much, Bob, for the question. And I noticed that a second questioner, a critiquer, has also referenced the relevance of an advisory opinion. I think my view would be that yes, I think a request would actually be quite a positive step to take, and I think there are a number of reasons for that. Clearly, ITLOS can provide advisory opinions. It's done so in the past. 2015, I think it was, in relation to the obligations of states with respect to their vessels fishing in the zones of other states. More generally, I think the experience of the Chagos advisory opinion with the ICJ has actually been a really interesting one, in the sense that obviously advisory opinions are clearly advisory, but the implications of that opinion have been quite far-reaching. And I think it has certainly actually inspired states to think about using the advisory jurisdiction to provide kind of clarification and maybe to push the agenda on these issues. So it would appear to be that Vanuatu are clearly going to request an advisory opinion of the ICJ in relation to climate more generally. And I think there's also been a bit of movement at COP26, sort of interest in actually seeking an ITLOS advisory opinion. I think it's potentially useful in sort of teasing out what the obligation might be, certainly in the context of due diligence. But Danielle, I think you make a really valid point in terms of how you sort of manage the intersection of the various regimes and the expectations of regimes. And of course, you know, a very significant component of the UNFCCC has been the idea of the differential obligations as between states and the balancing of the obligations of developed and developing states and kind of the reciprocal arrangements between those states. And of course, those features, those values are not necessarily embedded within other regimes, so certainly not within UNCLOS to the same extent. So there certainly are challenges in kind of using other regimes as a sort of a means to support and develop sort of obligations relating to climate. But I would say overall, I think it's a sort of a valid exercise, if only to sort of tease out what those obligations might be. I can talk further about this, but I'll hand over to the other speakers.
Thank you very much, Karen. Ambassador, would you like to come in on that?
Thank you. I just want to simplify, the issue. I don't want to sound corny, but we have one Earth, okay, one ocean shared together, blah blah blah, But there's so many instruments with different level, okay, and its instruments are actually talking about the same thing, but in actual fact they are not actually trying to address it. On one level, we are looking at ocean issue, pollution on the ocean, atmospheric pollution on the ocean, impact of that ocean has already seen. People know already what's going on, like what Nilu mentioned, all the way back in those days, in the 80s, and the research coming from Professor Scott was very clear, the impact, so it's there. But when we are actually talking about this particular impact in the context of the climate, we only have informal dialogue, right? And it is frustrating because it is the same country, same guys, if you will, that is actually discussing the issue. So advisory opinion is not legally binding, but in the word of ICJ, it means it has legal weight. Okay, it has. They say in the website, advisory opinion has a moral authority. Either way, I think advisory opinion from the ICJ and ITLOS provides clarifications, because sometimes even the questions that is being posed is a question that we know the answer to. Okay, look at the example of the advisory opinion brought in by West African countries on the illegal fishing. The questions, I recall one of the questions was, if you are an international student, 101, you know the answer. Okay. The question was, what are the legal obligations of states in terms of preserving the environment from illegal fishing activities? We know the answer. But if the answer comes from the court, right, then it has a different legal weight in and of itself. So I think it provides clarity, and it becomes a reference that we can quote. Countries can make policy on the basis of that, and countries can even start litigation against different countries, for instance, if they want to, on the basis of the clarification provided by the advisory opinion. So we have our own perception, we have our own answer to all those questions that we have, but it's coming from us as individual or as an expert or as a country, individual country, but not coming from ICJ or ITLOS. So if we have a very clear reply, what are the connections, what are the nexus, can we use the legal obligation within the UNCLOS Chapter 12 to be implemented in the context of the UNFCCC discussion, for instance. And this will create, this will be a game changer, because UNFCCC is UN body. If there is a advisory opinion coming from UN family, I think UNFCCC will do a lot of changing the compass of the discussions, because otherwise, we will continue the informal discussion. We have the rejection on all the way back 2015. This is 2021. So how long are we going to have informal discussions on ocean, on the sidelines, the 5 years? And when are we going to mainstream it actually? And when we are going to mainstream it, quote unquote, within the formal discussion as one of the agenda, then when it's going to become, what will be the result? So, it's not clear. So, and at the same time, the member states of UNCLOS themselves, they don't seem to be incentivized to doing the NDC, they're taking care of the oceans, right? You see, so advisory opinion will work on both counts. Number one, to clarify the relationship between the instruments, and second, to give push individually to member states to do more. in implementation of the Chapter 12. So, and it's free. You don't have to hire a lawyer. You can do it yourself. You can have an organization. You can meet and you define the question and you send it by fax. It's free. Okay, you don't need to hire 1,000 euros per hour lawyers, to do this kind of advisory opinion. So especially now with the Zoom, conferences and discussion can be done online. So yeah, why not? Thanks.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Havas, for the and comments actually remind me of a recent development, as I think Karen had alluded to it as well at COP26. And the recent development in COP26, which actually not so much on the sidelines of COP26, was the announcement of the establishment of this new body, this new commission of small island development states on climate change law and on climate change and international law. And in this context, I had a recent conversation with the appointed counsel to the commission under the CIL's COP26. I'm making a plug for that. CIL's COP26 conversation series, where Professor Paramakavan also reflected in a way the comments of Ambassador Havas, in the sense that how long do we wait? It is in those the small island developing states. How long do they wait for this issue to be addressed? And this initiative was in part, I guess, a part of that conversation and of the situation. So Nilofer, if I may turn to you, would you have any comments to add on that? I mean, there are a lot of pros, but are there any comments?
Yes, I do. I do have some comments. In addition, actually, because I think that advisory opinions are an underutilized but very valuable interpretive tool we have. What's really important, particularly, is when you have new developments and for example, the Law of the Sea Convention, let's say, doesn't address it directly. And that was one of the great benefits of the IUU fishing advisory opinion, because, for example, it said nothing about the Law of the Sea Convention in terms of flag state obligations for fishing vessels, right? The obligations were not specifically to fishing vessels under Article 94, I believe. And through an advisory opinion, the tribunal was able to actually incorporate new developments, such as the whole concept of IUU fishing, obligations. So as much as, it's the Constitution for the Ocean, the Law of the Sea Convention, it's a living instrument, and the law evolves. An advisory opinion is a very useful tool to help in that evolutive interpretation. And I think we can say that again with climate change and the Law of the Sea Convention. Climate change was not an issue in 1982 when it was adopted, certainly not during that 9-year period of negotiation. It is something that is an issue afterwards in the late 80s. Does that mean it doesn't apply? Of course not. Karen gave a very good example of, and also Ambassador Havas. But to have, as Ambassador Havas said, to have a tribunal or the ICJ make what are authoritative statements, because yes, not legally binding, but we know now from the CBED, the Special Chamber's very interesting judgment in the Mauritius Maldives case, that they have, important weight, important authoritative weight. So, and it's also, when you think about it, much more democratic, because exactly any state can participate in an advisory opinion. Whereas in bilateral disputes, it's limited, of course. But you just have to be able to use it properly, advisory opinions. So I think there's absolutely good usage would be on something like ocean acidification, the obligations, We've had now a lovely expose about the due diligence obligations. So I think states really need to be taking advantage of these tools, particularly since getting an advisory opinion under ITLOS is much simpler than ICJ. There you have to go to the General Assembly, it's much more complicated. So I would be favorable towards that.
Thank you very much, Nilufer. And I gather from the comments of all three panelists that they're really pro, in favor, and can see the advantages of using an advisory opinion mechanism. Of course, I guess it remains what the objections to that would be, as we have seen that from the third-party interventions in interventions and the comments in those cases, how that will feature. But very interesting and very balanced. And I think this is a wonderful lead off to the question from Kimberly Graham, which is on the chat function, flagging that the UK Parliament is currently undertaking an inquiry to explore the extent to which UNCLOS remains fit for purpose in 2021. Taking into account climate change, autonomous maritime systems, issues of human rights and human security at sea, all of which are extremely pertinent. We just did not have the time to address that in the context of our conversation today. Maybe a further series of events would be helpful. And Kimberly asked for the thoughts from the panelists, what you think of this, and to what extent, if any, the limited integration of ocean science into the international climate change regime reflects the skepticism or resistance, in fact, towards the inclusion of scientific knowledge in international law and policy. Do you think the attitudes towards science in international law have changed over time? So I will leave that question, of course, given time, I'll leave that question to panelists. And I would also take this opportunity to pose a last question to panelists, which I hope you also address. And what do you anticipate? And in fact, what would you hope to see in terms of this ocean climate nexus in the lead up to COP27 and beyond? Ambassador Havas, would you like to start us off on this question?
Yeah, on the scientist issue, I think I'm not from the scientific community, but I cannot fully answer the pertinent questions. But if I look at the delegation from scientists who are coming to COPs year on, year in and out, it's forestry experts, right? Experts on peatlands. Okay, I've seen it from our delegation, for instance. Mangrove, even very rare. It's only just recently that we brought in mangrove into the discussions of climate change. And even mangrove in Indonesia is part of the Ministry of Forestry, not Ministry of the Ocean Affairs. I want to be as frank as possible, okay? I don't know about other countries because it says mangrove forests, doesn't therefore under forestry. Although it's in the oceans, although it's on the coastal area, and it's been proven to be very strong in fighting tsunami, for instance. So I think this is the issue that I've found in my own observations, and because we are coming from people with a different scientific background, therefore the argument, the discussion would also come up differently. And I would imagine majority of member states of UNFCCC are coming from this terrestrial approach. So that is why it's not their fault because it's their design to think like that. And I think this is the challenge that has to be, overcome. Anticipations, Danielle. I anticipate not much going on until we have something really different, that would guide the countries on both sides, on the sides of the member states of the Convention of the Sea, on the sides of the member states of the UNFCCC, to actually do something much more meaningful than informal dialogue. It's very unfortunate, I think, although in the past, I've been quite happy to see that you have Blue COP, People are talking about more oceans in the COP, but the form that is coming out, it's really not what I'm thinking. You know, maybe at some point there will be an agenda within the UNFCCC, but it's still informal now. And you know, in the UN, how you trickle from informal to formal, it's, you know, forever. I have my assignments in Geneva. I know what how it works. You know, New York the same thing. So it's going to be long and tedious process. While at the same time, the environment it's you know, in a very bad conditions. So we have no time to wait, and there must be a breakthrough. And in my thinking, the only realistic breakthrough, simple, not expensive, is advisory opinion, because the other will be costly. And you organize another diplomatic conferences, you know, you hear countries making all statements once again. It's tedious. But once you have a guidelines, a guidance, and also the authoritative statement like what Nilu mentioned, and people start you know, to pay attention much more you know, strongly, especially the member states of Convention of the Low Sea themselves, who so far only 54 out of 168 that actually said something about the ocean, but at the same time being partly of UNCLOS. So I think that's my take. You know, we have to be solution oriented, right? We cannot just put the problems. We know the problems, but what are the solutions and how we do it? So, I mean, this is my 10 cents of it. Thanks, Danielle.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for that clarion call and the recommendation, one of the recommendations for the way forward. Perhaps something we can all anticipate and look forward to. Karen, may I now turn to you to address this question? And thank you.
Thank you very much, Danielle. So to take the couple of the questions, so in terms of Kimberly's question with respect to science, the issue of skepticism, kind of resistance, and whether more generally attitudes towards science have sort of changed in international law over time. Science is obviously sort of fundamental, and I think it can sort of shift the political dial. And I think perhaps the clearest example in the climate context that has happened is the sort of the shift between the 2 and the 1.5 degree target. So I think there is an increasing acceptance on the part of states that we should be aiming for 1.5 as opposed to 2 degrees. And that does really seem to be driven by the science in terms of what the implications of a 2 degree versus a 1.5 degree increase would be. But to be honest with you, I don't really see the issue as being kind of a science one within the UNFCCC. You know, we have sufficient science. You know, we've got the information in terms of, we know what we've got to do. So the issue isn't lack of science or even necessarily resistance to science, I think now. It's lack of political will. But I do see science as, you know, as having a really important sort of role to play in terms of shifting that. And the temperature is one example of that. Just to pick up very quickly on just a couple of questions which were in the chat. So Kritika, I think her first part of her question just referred to the relevance of the CBD in terms of ocean acidification. And yes, it absolutely is a relevant regime. Less, I think, in terms of the specific obligations, but played quite an important role in actually highlighting the issue. So published a couple of really prominent reports, and also has done some work on ocean fertilization, which has a connection with ocean acidification. And Danielle, you asked right at the very beginning, is ocean acidification a contributor to climate change or a consequence of climate change? And I would actually say neither. It's a separate issue. So it has a common cause, the common cause being excess of CO2 emissions, that being the primary cause. So it's closely connected to climate change, but it is separate from it, and it is more than a consequence. And in terms of sort of the ocean dialogue and what I'd like to see, I mean, that's quite a hard question. I'd probably like to think a little bit more about it. I mean, I think there are all sorts of connections that could be made, and not just in terms simply of mitigation, but things like actually integrating climate change more into things like fisheries management, area protection, sort of climate refuge year. So kind of thinking more broadly about the climate oceans nexus in terms of adaptation. And of course, geoengineering, ocean fertilization. So kind of looking at the oceans as a sort of a savior in terms of climate change. There does seem to be this resurgence in interest in geoengineering, and the oceans is potentially a part of that. So I would kind of want to see that in terms of the climate dialogue. But I think, like His Excellency Havas, I'm quite sceptical in the fact that it's an informal dialogue. Yeah, I think my inclination is more the law of the sea is the way forward, as opposed to looking at the UNFCCC as being the sole potential solution.
Thank you very much, Karen. And may I finally invite Niloufar, Center Director, to perhaps end of our discussion today with her remarks on any of the questions that have been posed.
Well, I think we've come to the end. We're over time, so I won't say too much other than, of course, I think that my panelists have all made very good points. I agree with them. I also agree it's not a question of, a resistance to science, but it's politics. These negotiations are very political. And I think you have to see that the international law process is a very conservative process and very averse to change. So bringing the ocean in is bringing in the change, and it's difficult for them to adapt. So, but on the other hand, absolutely, Ambassador, we don't have much time. This is the reality. The ocean is deteriorating very quickly, and that means we're going to deteriorate as well. So we have to find solutions, and we just have to look at different avenues, CBD, advisory opinions. There's not one single solution, but there's a collective solution we have to look at. And I think that these types of meetings, I hope, are helping us think about that to move forward. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Niloufar. And with that, again, my warm thanks to all the panelists for a really excellent discussion, very much food for thought. We'll all think about that. And also to our participants with us this entire 1.5 hours. It just reflects the amount of interest in this topic. So with that, I wish everyone a good evening, good night, good day, good morning to everyone. I know we have participants from all around the world. It's been a wonderful conversation, and I hope to see everyone again in person soon. Thank you. Good day.